Selamat pagi sahabat Katadata, salam sehat selalu. Anda masih bergabung dalam rangkaian acara menuju ulang tahun Katadata yang ke-9. Katadata mempersembahkan Indonesia Data and Economic Conference atau IDE Katadata 2021, Reimagining the Future of Indonesia bersama saya Maria Margareta. IDE Katadata merupakan event tahunan Katadata yang akan menyuguhkan beragam diskusi inspiratif seputar data dan juga ekonomi secara virtual yang digelar dari tanggal 22 Maret hingga 25 Maret 2021. Acara ini disponsori oleh East Ventures, Bank DBS Indonesia, PT Barito Pacific Tbk, PT PLN Persero, Unilever Indonesia, GIZ, German International Cooperation, link aja. Acara ini juga didukung oleh GoPlay, Oxford Business Group, serta para media partners, Media Group, Metro TV, Media Indonesia, Medcom.id, dailysocial.id, Berita 1, Tech in Asia, Kompas.com, dan juga Net. Dan khususnya penyelenggaraan IDE Katadata 2021 di hari keempat ini disponsori oleh PT Barito Pacific Tbk. Tayangan ini juga dapat Anda saksikan selain via Zoom webinar di Facebook Katadata Indonesia, YouTube Katadata Indonesia, Instagram Katadata.co.id, dan tentunya kunjungi website kami di katadata.co.id. Diskusi ini berlangsung secara bilingual. Bagi Anda yang ingin mendengarkan dalam bahasa Inggris, silakan untuk mengaktifkan fitur interpretation di aplikasi Zoom Anda, lalu pilih atau klik English. Baik, sahabat Katadata, pandemi COVID-19 menciptakan tantangan ekonomi yang luar biasa bagi dunia, tidak terkecuali di Indonesia. Di tengah keterpurukan ekonomi dunia, adakah sebenarnya peluang-peluang yang bisa Indonesia manfaatkan untuk kembali membangkitkan geliat ekonomi nasional? Menarik untuk kita simak analisa mendalam berikut ini dari seorang penulis buku dan Emeritus Professor of Economics dari Boston University, Amerika Serikat, Profesor Gustav F. Papanek.
Selamat pagi. Welcome to this webinar. The in economic situation in Indonesia differed greatly depending which group you belong to in the last 20 years or so. During the commodity boom from 2000 to 2015 or 16, the average Indonesian had an increase in income of over 50%. But there were large groups of workers who were left out of this improvement in the situation. If you can show the slide, you can see that the average Indonesian is the black line that increases pretty steadily over the period as a whole. Can we go to that slide? No, it's an earlier slide than this. Can we, here we are. So this line shows the income of the average Indonesian, and it rises very nicely over the years. There was one group of Indonesians who did even better than that, and those were the industrial workers whose income or wage actually increased by about 65% over this period as a whole. So the average Indonesian 50-some%, the average industrial worker, 65%. But look at the bottom line. Those are agricultural workers' wages, and they actually declined during this period. The wages declined about 15%. So not only were they not better off, they were worse off. Pembantu, or household servants, had a small increase at the beginning, and then their wages stagnated during the period as a whole. They stopped benefiting. And the third line are construction workers, and their wages increased very little compared to the average. So these were three groups that were left behind and that were felt they were not benefiting from development at all. And for the agricultural workers, they were actually worse off. How come this happened? Why were there these differences for different groups? Well, the main reason, if we go to the next slide, we can see again what happened to the consumption of the different groups. From 1984 to 1996, all groups advanced more or less equally. But then from 2000 to 2016, the poorest groups gained the least benefit. The red are the poorest 20%, and their consumption over these 16 years increased only 22%, while the richest 20% had their consumption increased by over 100%, by 5 times as much. So income distribution became much less equal. The poorest groups were left the most behind. The poorest 40% gained only 30%. The wealthiest 40% gained 63%, and the richest gained 100%. Please go to the next slide. This was despite the fact that the economy as a whole was moving ahead at 5% over this period. But now the future is much less promising than the past, because the world economy is slowing down greatly. The growth of the world economy is going to be 7% slower this year than it was last year. Last year, it was growing about 3.5%, and this year it's going to be declining by 3.5%. So Indonesia will face a much more difficult economic situation. All of the countries with which Indonesia trades are going to be growing much more slowly. So the poorer groups are likely to be even worse off in the future than they were in the past, because there will be an increasing number of surplus workers. You know, there are two groups of workers in Indonesia. Those who get a real job, a job that is created because there is a need for workers. Those are jobs in the formal sector, like manufacturing, construction, transportation, and communications. But there are not enough jobs created in these sectors to employ all the additions to the labor force. Every year, on average, 2 million additional workers join the labor force, all looking for employment. But there are not 2 million jobs created. There are only about slightly more than 1 million jobs created. What happens to the other workers? Well, poor people in Indonesia cannot be unemployed. If they don't have a job, they don't eat. So they need employment. So if they can't find a job in an industry or sector that requires their work, they crowd into occupations where they can absorb any number of workers where there used to be 3 family members working on a small plot. There are now 4 family members working on that same plot. The 4th person isn't needed. He's surplus, or she is surplus. They don't add anything to production, but they have the job because they can't find any other job. So the family allows them to work on the family plot and they share in the proceeds, but they're not contributing to output. They're surplus. And where there used to be 2 people shining shoes at an intersection, there are now 3 people shining the same number of shoes, or 4 people shining the same number of shoes, but each of them had a smaller income because there are no more shoes to be shined, but there are more people shining shoes and sharing in the proceeds. So over this period of the commodity boom, 20 million workers were surplus, couldn't get real employment, and went into work and income sharing activities. What is the evidence that there are these surplus workers? Well, if we look at what happens when there are jobs to be had in manufacturing, look at this line here, which shows the number of jobs created in manufacturing. You can see from 88, 89 to 95, 97, there were 610,000 jobs on average created in manufacturing. From 2016 to 2019, the number of jobs in manufacturing was even more than 1 million jobs. So when there were jobs in manufacturing, the number of workers in agriculture and fisheries declined. There were surplus workers in this activity, and when there were jobs to be had in manufacturing, they left agriculture, they left fisheries, and they became workers in manufacturing with double the wage, a much higher wage, much better working conditions. But during this period from 1995-97 to 2015-16, there were only 400,000 jobs created in manufacturing. Not enough jobs to employ the additions to the labor force, much less to employ workers who were leaving agriculture. So instead of the numbers of workers in agriculture declining, the numbers actually increased. 138,000 additional workers joined agriculture and fisheries every year. Did the output increase? No, actually output of agriculture did not increase by more, it increased by less. These were surplus workers who were working in agriculture and fisheries, not because their work was needed, but because they needed a job. There is a distinction between jobs created because workers are needed and jobs created because workers needed income. When there were surplus workers who couldn't find any other jobs and who crowded into agriculture and fisheries, they each shared a declining amount of income over time because they weren't really needed. They were working there and sharing in the output and in the work. So if you took account of the fact that normally in any society, over time, the number of workers in agriculture declines because fewer and fewer workers are needed. When you no longer harvest using an ani, but a sickle, you need about 10% of the workers you used to need. When you use a Japanese rice huller instead of rice pounding, you need fewer workers. So the number of workers needed in agriculture declines by about 750,000 a year. But if they don't have any other jobs, they cannot leave agriculture. They have to stay and share in whatever there is to be shared. So this is what happens during the period when there are jobs to be had in manufacturing. Look what happened to the number of workers in agriculture. Declined from 41 million workers to 35 million workers. But in this period, there were not enough jobs in manufacturing, so the number of workers in agriculture actually increased. If there had been jobs in manufacturing, the number of workers would have continued to decline. And by 2015-16, there would have been only 20 million workers in agriculture, because each year, 750,000 workers would have left agriculture and gone into manufacturing, construction, and so on. But in fact, there were no other jobs to be had, so the number of workers in agriculture actually declined. The difference between the number of workers needed, 20.5 million, and the actual number of workers in agriculture, 38 billion, are 17.5 million surplus workers. Workers who are not really needed, but who are there because they can't get any other employment and they need employment in order to eat. In addition, the number of unemployed workers also increased from 4.2 million to 7 million. So another additional 3 million surplus workers who couldn't find any jobs. You add 3 million to the 17.5 million, and you have somewhere between 19.5 and 20.5 million surplus workers. In 2019, between 2016 and 2019, manufacturing grew rapidly, and employment in manufacturing grew rapidly, and the number of surplus workers declined by a small amount. In 2020, the situation became actually worse. If we show 2020, or can you not move the slide a little bit over? In 2020, as you know, the situation has become much worse, and about 5 million workers lost their formal employment and became surplus. So in 2020, the number of surplus workers is even greater. When the number of surplus workers increases, when there are more workers looking for work in agriculture than are needed, the income that each worker gets declines. So the number of surplus workers increases, the income of each is less. And that is what happened during the commodity boom, because while the economy was doing well, there were very few jobs created in manufacturing or anywhere else. True work demand for labor of unskilled workers was very low. So the number of surplus workers increased and their income declined. The future depends again on whether the number of jobs created in manufacturing and other formal sector employment exceeds the number of workers entering the labor force and looking for work. 2 million entering the labor force without reforms, with a 3% rate of growth, which is, or 4%, less than it has been in the past. The number of workers absorbed by the formal sector will not be enough to take care of the 2 million a year who join the labor force. The number added to surplus workers will be greater than it has been in the past. And the number of surplus workers who are being left behind, who are not benefiting from development without reforms, is likely to be worse than it has been in the past. And the number of workers who feel left out, who feel neglected, who feel that the economy is not benefiting them at all, will increase. And if the economy as a whole is growing, but large groups of agricultural workers, household servants, street peddlers, and other informal sector workers is increasing, you have a sure prescription for social and political tensions. These are going to be workers who feel the economy is not benefiting them, that it is benefiting a small group of wealthier people. With significant reforms, which I will come to in a minute, what these are, the number of jobs created will be larger than the additions to the labor force of 2 million a year. Every year, all of the workers entering the labor force will find formal sector jobs, plus an additional 1 million people who are now surplus will be joining formal sector occupations. When there are workers who are moving from being surplus to being employed in manufacturing and construction and transportation and so on, their wages will double. The wages in agriculture are about half what they are in manufacturing. And manufacturing, in addition, has fringe benefits like health services and vacation time and holidays pay. So the workers in manufacturing are much better off than the workers in agriculture. So every 1 million workers who are leaving agriculture and joining manufacturing increases per capita, increases GDP by about 1.2%. So they're contributing significantly to increased growth. But they are also benefiting. Their wages double. At the same time, the income of the workers who are left behind in work and income sharing also increases. Because now, where there used to be 4 shoe shiners at the corner, sharing in shining 1,000 shoes, now there are only 3 people at that same corner shining the same 1,000 shoes. So their income has increased by a quarter. So everyone is better off when there are enough jobs created to absorb the additions to the labor force, plus some of the workers that have been surplus and that have shared in work and income where they're not needed. So the key to everybody in society being better off is enough jobs to be created in manufacturing and related activities to absorb all the additions to the labor force, plus some of the surplus workers that are already in the economy. And that requires much more radical reforms that have taken place in the past. The reforms that have been carried out have been useful, but they've not been sufficient to create enough manufacturing jobs to absorb the additions to the labor force plus some of the surplus workers. The reason is that Indonesia does not compete effectively in the world market for manufactured goods. If we go back to the slide that showed what happened in the period from 1988-89 to 95-97, Indonesia was competing effectively in the world market. How come? Well, because wages in Indonesia were very low. Workers were exploited. Yeah, unions were not effective. They were substantially suppressed. Wages did not rise by much. So Indonesia was able to compete because it had low wages. Now, this is no longer possible to exploit labor to the same degree. Wages have risen substantially. Indonesia's minimum wages have risen more rapidly than the minimum wage of competing countries. The Bangladesh wage is about half the wage in Indonesia. So Bangladesh can outcompete Indonesia, even though it has worse infrastructure and used to have a very uncertain political situation. Vietnam's wage has been lower than in Indonesia's substantially. The only country with a higher wage has been China, and China is no longer able to compete in labor-intensive manufactured goods. What happened from 2016 to 2019? How come we had this big burst in manufactured employment? Well, because this manufacturing was developing not in Jakarta, where wages were high and uncompetitive. In fact, there was no increase in employment in the Jabodetabek area. The increased employment, this 1 million, was mostly in Semarang, where wages were very low in central Java. And the industrial development took place mostly in central Java and to a lesser extent in eastern Java, where wages were relatively low and Indonesia was able to compete. This came to an end with the virus catastrophe that hit all countries hard and reduced world demand tremendously. What does Indonesia need to do to compete in the future? There are two sources of significant employment for semi-skilled, unskilled workers, the lower income groups. So this I have already covered. So as workers move from informal work in income sharing sector to employment in manufacturing and tourism, they get increased wages. The workers left behind also get increased income as fewer workers share in the employment. Even after the surplus labor is fully employed, the only families that remain poor are those that have no one in the labor force. That's a very small group compared to the 40% who are poor now. What are the reforms that are needed in order to bring about this situation in which everyone in the country benefits, including the ones who work in agriculture, in household servants, or in construction? Can we go to the next slide? This shows the difference between with reform and without reform. The average per capita income without reform by 2024, the increase in average per capita income will just be 5%. With reform, 12%. By 2045, without reform, per capita income will less than double. With reform, it will be threefold what it is in 2019. Those are huge differences. This shows the same differences in terms of US dollars or rupiah. So without reform, the average income in 2024 will be barely above the 59.5 million rupiah a month it is now. It'll have gone to 62. With reform, it will have gone to 66. And the difference is even greater, but it's hidden away behind the picture of me that you could do without. I could show you I wish I could show you but the per capita increase will be 225% increase, which means it'll be 3 times what it was in 2019. Let's go to the next slide, which shows the reforms we recommend. Now, these are going to be difficult reforms to carry out, not easy at all. If they were easy and simple, they would have been done long time ago, yeah? But the alternative is really quite dramatic. If Indonesia does not carry out major reforms and continues to grow slowly with large groups left behind, it's going to be hard to see how Indonesia will remain a tolerant and broad-minded and democratic society, because the people who are left behind and left out are going to be angry people. That's always true. When you see that some people are benefiting from development and you're not benefiting at all, you're actually worse off. You're not a happy person. You're not a person who is broad-minded and willing to let others enjoy the benefits of growth if you're left out. So I think these reforms are difficult to carry out, but the benefits are huge. What are these 5 pillars of reform? The 5 major reforms. First of all, is to allow the rupiah to become more affordable. All countries that have successfully developed their industry have had a undervalued currency in order to be able to compete more effectively. If the rupiah declines in value by 10%, it's like a 10% subsidy to every exporter and to every manufacturer competing with imports. The cost of imports rises, so it's easier to compete with the imports and to produce domestically what used to be imported. Indonesia, for instance, could save a huge amount of foreign exchange if it shifted from imported gasoline and kerosene to domestically produced gas to fuel automobiles and buses. And if the price of imported gasoline and kerosene increases 10% or 15%, people will be more interested in shifting to using compressed natural gas to fuel cars and buses. But these devaluations have taken place in the past, and their benefits don't last, because when you have a devaluation, the price of imported food rises, right? And a lot of Indonesian food is imported. Rice is imported, wheat is imported, soybeans are imported. Their prices rise. And within 18 months, wages have risen also in order to maintain the workers' income. And as wages rise, the benefits of devaluation disappear. That has always been true in the past. So people have said, well, these are not, the devaluation doesn't benefit the country very long. It's just a short-term benefit. But what we recommend is a compensated devaluation, which means you don't allow the price of imported foods and other imported goods consumed by the lower income groups to rise. How can you prevent that? Well, it's relatively simple in the Indonesian case, because the price of rice in Indonesia has generally been above the price in the world as a whole, which is one of the reasons Indonesia has a difficult time competing with Vietnam. The price of rice in Vietnam is much lower than in Indonesia. The price of all foods is much lower. So workers can have a lower wage and still be just as well off as in Indonesia, because the prices of goods they buy is lower. And why is that? Well, because there is a tariff on imported rice, which increases the price of rice in Indonesia and benefits the food mafia, the people who get an import license for rice and the people who provide an import license for rice. Because the price in Indonesia is higher than in the world, you buy it cheaply in the world and you sell it more expensively in Indonesia. And you earn the difference as a profitable part of your business. So you benefit if you get an import license, and you benefit if you have the power to allocate an import license. So if you break the food mafia, if you allow the price of rice in Indonesia to come down to where it is in the world, then you can devalue the currency and the price of rice will not rise. Just the profitability of rice importing will decline. The same is not true of wheat or soybeans. The difference in the world and Indonesian price is much less. And you may have to subsidize. Horror, horror, horror. Some people will say subsidies are bad things, not if they prevent the price of the major commodities that workers consume is stabilized. That's what was done earlier and what can be done again. You stabilize the price of the food, and then the wages will not rise, and the benefits of devaluation will last for a longer period of time and will enable Indonesia to compete more effectively because the wages will not continue to be higher than in competing countries. You need to take one other step in order to keep the wage low without exploiting workers. What matters to a worker is not just how many rupiah he gets paid for his work, but what he can buy with these rupiah. You're not allowed to subsidize exports. That's against the world trade organization's rules. You're not allowed to subsidize exports, but many countries subsidize some of the goods that workers buy. So you can increase the real income of workers by subsidizing the goods and services workers buy, by subsidizing their housing, their transport, their canteen purchases, their health services. You can keep the wage the same, but subsidize the price of goods and services workers buy, and they will be better off. It'll be just like raising their wages, but the cost to the employer will not increase. And you do that in areas where manufacturers are producing for export, and this is, keep that a secret. It's an indirect, hidden way of really supporting exports. So that is the step number 2. You're keeping the minimum wage from rising, but you're keeping workers better off by subsidizing the goods and services they buy, the kind of subsidies that many governments do subsidize, low-cost housing, workers' health, and so on. The third element in the package of 5 pillars of economic reforms is to focus government investment in infrastructure in areas where private investment is taking place, in manufacturing for export and in tourism. You don't want to invest in government infrastructure in tourist areas where there is no investment in hotels. There's no use having a nice new airport if there's no hotel in the same area or no 5-star hotel. At the same time, there's no use having a 5-star hotel in an area if there's no good airport. We would therefore recommend that 15% of all the money set aside for infrastructure development be set aside only for areas where there is private investment in hotels, where the tourist area will develop. If there is potential for tourism, there'll be somebody interested in building a hotel. And the government can make a contract with that hotel investor that if the investment takes place in hotels, the government will also invest in improving roads, in providing steady power, in providing clean water, and so on. Similarly, where investors are putting money, as they are now in Semarang and Central Java more generally, in production of manufactured goods for export, there needs to be government investment in infrastructure, because the 2 high items of cost for Indonesian manufacturers are labor and infrastructure. And if you can lower the cost of both, you can compete more effectively. So if you don't need to invest in a standby generator because government is providing safe and lower cost power, then you are more competitive. If you don't have to run standby generators that require expensive diesel fuel because there is a reliable power supply, you can compete more effectively. If your trucks can operate at 100 kilometers an hour, you need 1/3 as many trucks as if the roads are only capable of speeds of 30 kilometers an hour. So if government provides decent roads, the industrialist will require 1/3 as many trucks and save the investment in trucks. So this is a symbiotic relationship between government investment in infrastructure and private investment in tourism and manufacturing. Number 4, substantially increase government revenues to finance these policy changes. We've proposed subsidy to workers' housing, transport, health, etc. That takes money. At the moment, government doesn't have the funds to do this kind of subsidy because government revenues are very low in Indonesia. We're proposing a guaranteed employment program to employ workers in the off-season in constructing a local infrastructure. That requires money. So many of our recommendations require an increase in government resources. And so the 4th pillar is to increase government revenue. The last pillar is reform of education. Anybody who has looked at the list of the top universities in the world will find that Indonesia is not represented among the top 100 universities. India is represented. What is the difference between the two countries? Not much difference in the general educational system. Both educational systems in general teach people not to think, but to memorize. But India has a small elite system which is as good as any in the world. There are in the top 100 universities a couple of Indian universities, no Indonesian universities. That needs to change. There needs to be a handful, there needs to be one first-rate economics department in Indonesia that is at world standard. There needs to be one first-rate engineering department that is of world standards. There needs to be a handful of institutions that can turn out the managers, the technicians, to run the competitive industries that Indonesia needs. And that requires massive reforms of secondary education and selective improvement of a few universities or a few departments in different universities. Those are the 5 pillars of reform. Let me just mention there are 3 other areas that require reform. One is corruption. In the recent past, Indonesia has deteriorated with respect to corruption perception. It was improving for a period of time. It has deteriorated more recently. That makes it less competitive. When the system is more corrupt, there is a cost to enterprises. And that has deteriorated as KPK has become weaker. Number 1 is that is number 2 is to I will be finished in 1 minute. Number two is to improve the ease of doing business. There has been some substantial improvement in that respect, which has now come to an end, in part again because of the worsening of corruption. And finally, Indonesia needs to become more attractive for foreign private investment. Now, I have no particular brief for private investment as against public investment. The problem is that Indonesia needs both. And it needs to attract more foreign private investment because the domestic rate of investment is not large enough, and it does not bring with it the same improvements in technology that you get from some foreign private investment. If the communist countries can attract more foreign private investment, a private enterprise economy like Indonesia should be able to do the same thing. And remember that foreign private investment tends to be a temporary thing. In many countries, the textile industry and the garment industry was started by Koreans, and they lasted only long enough until the local people learned the business, and then they took over. And by now, even in Bangladesh, where the garment industry used to be entirely headed by Koreans, there's only one Korean firm left. The rest are all Bangladeshi firms. It was just, they needed the Koreans long enough to learn the business, and then they took over from them. That is the way the Chinese have operated very effectively, and it's the way in which Indonesia can benefit from foreigners. It's best to have Indonesia exploit foreign investors rather than to have foreign investors exploit Indonesians. So that is the other three minor steps that are helpful, but the key steps are the 5 pillars of reform, all of which are entirely feasible in Indonesia. One last remark. People sometimes say, this is all theoretical. You can't compete in the world market because that is already taken over by other countries, and you can't break into it unless you have a labor, you exploit labor mercilessly. This is simply not true. If I can get to my last table, manufactured exports from Indonesia have doubled in the last 20 years. They've increased 20 times from Vietnam. Why is there such a big difference? Well, Vietnam has had low-cost rice and therefore low-cost labor, and therefore has been able to increase its exports 20 times since I think 2008 is the base, and 2020 is the last year. Even Bangladesh has increased its exports 8-fold, India 7-fold. Only Indonesia has fallen behind. Don't let it fall behind even more, because if it does, it will become increasingly difficult to catch up. Right now, Indonesia has a large pool of surplus labor who can be put to work and can increase output tremendously if they move from being surplus in agriculture to being productive in manufacturing. But that demographic dividend will be gone in another 10 years. And if it's not used to increase output, it will be very hard for Indonesia to catch up in the future. And that would be very sad indeed. Thank you very much.
Ya, baik sahabat Katadata, baru saja Anda menyaksikan pemaparan yang sangat detail dan lengkap dari Profesor Gustav F. Papanek, penulis buku dan Emeritus Professor of Economics dari Boston University, Amerika Serikat. Terima kasih Prof. Gustav karena telah bergabung di acara IDE Katadata Indonesia 2021. Acara ini disponsori oleh East Ventures, Bank DBS Indonesia, PT Barito Pacific Tbk, PT PLN Persero, Unilever Indonesia, GIZ, German International Cooperation, Link Aja. Acara ini juga didukung oleh GoPlay, Oxford Business Group, serta para media partners, Media Group, Metro TV, Media Indonesia, Medcom.id, dailysocial.id, Berita 1, Tech in Asia, Kompas.com, dan juga Net. Baik pemirsa, menanggapi pemaparan menarik tadi dari Profesor Gustav, selanjutnya kita akan bedah lebih lanjut dan lebih dalam melalui live dialog bersama para ekonom senior tanah air. Kami akan segera kembali, jadi pastikan tetaplah bersama kami. Saya Maria Margareta, sampai jumpa.